Good morning, everyone. I hope you've had a good week so far. We've taken a small break from the Rollo Devos, but since we're not going to be able to meet together as a youth group, a large group, anytime soon, unfortunately, I'm going to continue to keep these up. It is my prayer that they help draw you closer to God during this time, and they encourage you to continue to read His Word. Remember, I'm not going to be able to read the whole passage in most of these Devos for the sake of keeping them short, but I encourage you to go and read it, meditate it on your own after you watch the video. Read it several times even, because the more we read God's Word, the more He focuses us on Himself and shows Himself to us in it. You know, in our day, there are lots of series of movies being produced. When I was your age, there were a few series of movies, and every few years you'd get a sequel, but most of the time there weren't. Today, they're really popular. In fact, nowadays, studios are even taking one story and dividing them up into two movies, probably mostly just so they can make more money off of us, but sometimes because they actually have a lot of content. Take The Hobbit, The Avengers, Star Wars, Toy Story, The Incredibles. There are lots of sequels and series of movies out there. And you know, with a sequel, you can't really get everything out of it without seeing the movies that come before it in the series. I mean, sure, you could watch The Rise of Skywalker by itself, but if you haven't seen the other movies, you aren't really going to be able to follow the plot, what little plot there was, very well. Well, today we're going to start studying the story of the Exodus, because it is the sequel to the story of Joseph, Jacob, Judah, and Jesus that we just finished in the Rollo Devos last week. The story of the Exodus is a riveting historical epic with lots of action and an incredible plot, but it's not something that just comes out of the blue. The story begins in the middle of things, with the adventure already underway from Genesis. In fact, if you were to read Exodus in the original Hebrew, you'd see that the very first word is the Hebrew conjunction and. I mean, that's showing us that Moses sees this story, his story, really is just a continuation of everything that's been happening so far, the much bigger story that's already going on. The story of the Exodus is part of the grand narrative of the Old Testament. It's the sequel to the promises that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob in the book of Genesis, where He promises to give them a land and a people. It's the beginning of those promises being fulfilled. And yet it's also the defining story of the entire Old Testament. And its importance even extends into the New Testament. You know, in the Narnia Chronicles, the death and resurrection of Aslan becomes the defining story for the whole series. But in particular, it's the defining story for Edmund's story. The White Witch had made her claim on Edmund's life because he was a traitor, yet Aslan gave himself, his own blood, his own life, as a sacrifice to redeem Edmund and to save all of Narnia from the power of the witch. And as you read through the series of the book, you see that Edmund has allowed that story to define his life from the point when he was redeemed by Aslan from then on out. In the book The Horse and His Boy, for example, at the end, when the kings have to figure out what to do with Prince Rabadash, who attacked Archenland without warning, without honor, Edmund says, "Even a traitor can mend. I know of one who did." And he pauses thoughtfully, solemnly, because he's thinking about the story that defines his life, that he was the traitor, that Aslan gave his life to mend. Or in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Eustace is undragoned, it's no accident that the very first character that Lewis has Eustace encounter is Edmund. When Eustace apologizes to Edmund for how awful he had been, Edmund says to Eustace that at least he was only a jerk. Edmund was a traitor when he first came to Narnia. And he tells him about Aslan, who saved him and saved all of Narnia. He could comfort the newly redeemed Eustace because he knew just how much Aslan had done to redeem him. And again, the story of Aslan redeeming Edmund defined his whole life. It's what he was always looking back on to understand his present circumstances. He was constantly looking back and saying, "That is the great lion that I serve. He redeemed me from death for my own sins, and I am his." You know, the Exodus story is the defining story of the whole Old Testament. It's the great miracle of the history of the Old Testament that the rest of the Old Testament looks back on as the pattern and proof of God's salvation and steadfast love for his people, no matter what they're going through. Many Psalms do this, like Psalm 106, for example. The prophets do this when they want to show that God's faithfulness will fulfill his promises that he's made to them, even though they're in a bad situation at the time. He redeemed them out of slavery. He saved them. And so they can all look back on that event and say, this is the God that we serve. He redeemed us. He saved us from slavery. He brought us into the land that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob. That means that we are his people, and he will take care of us today. The importance of that story then even extends into the New Testament, because it's replaced by the story of Jesus, Jesus' death and resurrection. In the New Testament, we see that the story of the Exodus is really just a shadow of what Jesus himself would do for his people, redeeming us out of slavery to sin, so that he can one day take us into the ultimate land that God had promised, the new heavens and the new earth, where we will one day live. That's why he was crucified on the day of the Passover, showing that it is really he, that the whole Old Testament, that the Exodus story in particular, was pointing forward to. And then his story becomes the defining story for our lives, just like the Exodus defined the lives of the Old Testament Jews, just like the death and resurrection of Aslan defined Edmund's life. It's the story that the whole Old Testament, that we can look back on and say, this is the God that I serve. He saved me from slavery to sin and death. That means we're his, I'm his, and he will take care of me today. So we're going to look at this story and study it and see how Jesus is shown to us in the great salvation that it represents, and how we can see ourselves in the neediness of the Jewish people. And in the meantime, ask yourself, does the death and resurrection of Jesus define my life every day? And do I look back on it like Edmund and like the Old Testament Jews look back on the Exodus and think, this is the God that I serve? You think about that, and I'll see you tomorrow.